This presentation explains about globalization and food security. So, what do we understand by the term food security? Food security is basically defined as a situation where all people at all times have access to safe, sufficient, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. So the idea is that the food should be readily available. Healthy choices should be readily available for people. It has to be sufficient in terms of the amount of food that is available. It has to be accessible not just in terms of monetarily accessible, which means that poor people should also be able to afford safe, good, nutritious food, but also accessible physically. That means, certain items, good items should of food that is really healthy should be available at all places, even in the slum areas, even in the poor areas, even in the poor colonies, localities, even in the far-flung areas where there's no transportation. Um, and also, food must meet the nutritious needs of everyone. It shouldn't be junk food just that's available or just pizza and burgers that are available. It has to be something that is healthy and nutritious for the people. So the idea of food security really covers both these aspects, food being physically available and food being economically available. So when we look at the statistics, what kind of food security and insecurity issue we have the world over, we know that 842 million people in the world do not have enough food to eat. And while we have been able to improve this situation by 17% since 1990 standards, we're still far behind. The vast majority of hungry people, which is 827 million people, live in developing countries, which means about 14.3% of the population is undernourished. And also, if we look at different regions of the world, we find Asia has the largest number of hungry people, over 500 million. But we also find that sub-Saharan Africa has the highest prevalence, 24.8% of the population is hungry. And of course, for Asia, we have that huge population because Asia is also the region where the largest number of people are there in terms of population, because India and China have the largest populations there. So, when we're looking at what this food insecurity does, it leads to poor nutrition, and poor nutrition causes nearly half of the deaths of children under 5. So 3.1 million children every year, die of undernourishment. 1 out of 6 children, roughly 100 million in developing countries, are underweight. 1 in 4 of the world's children are stunted. In developing countries, the proportion can rise to 1 in 3. So it's really very poor statistics that we have in relation to food and health. Now, when we talk about the idea of food insecurity, there are two kinds of insecurities that have been classified. One is a chronic food insecurity, which means persistently inadequate diet, which is caused by the inability of the households to acquire the needed food. That means they're all the time unable to do it, unable to get nutritious, good, safe, healthy food. And most often, this is all year round, all throughout. And this is basically rooted in poverty. Because people are poor, they are unable to afford that. So chronic food insecurity really comes from there. But there's also what we call as transitory food insecurity, which means there's a temporary decline in how a household can access the needed food. And this can result from several different factors, like instability in food prices or production or income of the household, say for a period of 5 months or 6 months. We have these cases where the crop has failed. So if the crop fails in some part of the country and people in another part use that food extensively in their cooking, then that they are food insecure. They may eat potatoes. Potato may be their staple diet, or rice may be their staple diet, but the crop has failed, so they are unable to access it. Example, very often in India we had these cases where we have a shortage of onions, and we know that onions do have a health benefit, and Indians love cooking with onions, and so the government has to intervene and brings in product imports from other countries and then rations it and gives it to people at a low price so that they can ensure that people have that in their diet and are eating that. And the question is that how this whole focus came to be on food security. Now, there was a lot of emphasis laid on the idea of food security in the year 2007 2008. Before that, from 1960s to 2000, prices of food items have substantially decreasing, so nobody was really bothered about that, or it didn't catch so much of an attention. From 2006 onwards, prices started increasing till middle of 2008, and that's when all the attention came to this problem. What were some of the reasons or some of the factors for this? One was the weather shocks. So as we see, global warming is happening, many natural disasters are there because of that, and which led to failure of crops. And when droughts happened in Australia, that reduced wheat production and reduced the trading of the wheat, which affected the price of wheat. And we know that wheat is a staple diet in many parts of the world. And so you kind of see this interconnection of environment with food, food health, and so on. So all these global problems are really interconnected, as you will see. Then, we started with globalization. We also started using or promoting biofuels, as we started talking about how we need to conserve our environment, etc. We started moving to biofuels, and biofuels meant increased demand for maize and vegetable oil, which then led to a shortage of those supplies for people to eat, and instead being used as biofuels. Then there was also, as economic growth is happening, certain developing countries are growing further, there is a lot of pressure on petroleum, and also the food needs of the people are changing. Okay, people are getting exposed to different kinds of foods, and they need different kind of food, they're exposed to different kind of food, they demand different kind of food items. Then there has also been slower cereal yield, because a lot of um, investment has not been in the agriculture sector. Investment is all moving to the industrial sector, to information technology and so on. And so the yield has been poor. While in the 60s and 70s, it was the age of green revolution and things like that. So there was a lot of emphasis on how do you increase production, how do you increase agricultural produce. And again, trade policies, export bans were there. There were trade policies, export bans, where countries were trying to protect their own farmers and so on. There was also aggressive buying, because when this started happening, the prices started increasing, government started buying, and which again led to this whole disproportion between supply and demand, leading to an increase in prices. So this is what is called as a panic buying that happened. So this is all what has been happening, and so a lot of emphasis started going to, because of all these factors, to the idea of how do we make sure that such situations don't happen, that there's no hoarding of produce by certain countries, manipulation of prices by different countries as they produce certain commodities and so on, and that food is readily available to everybody else, everybody who lives on this planet. So, some of the challenges that we look at when we're talking about food security is how do we address it? One, there has been a lot more focus on macroeconomic policies. That is, you just can't look at agriculture as a sector by itself. You have to also look at how agriculture is being affected by prices, by oil prices, by employment situation, by poverty alleviation programs. So you have to go beyond just looking at one sector, because with globalization we see this interconnectedness of all the different aspects. The second important thing is that if prices of food commodities increase, it's obviously better for exporting countries, that export certain of those products, which is not good for the importing countries, who may then have to invest in agriculture, or they may have to give subsidies, to their farmers, and this reduces the investment in other projects, and so it affects development. So that's another challenge. How do we address that? The third is, the idea of food storage and trade policies to, how much of food storage should be allowed, how much of control the world market should have on prices and trading policies and so on to stabilize the price. So there are different debates, for example, that happen between wheat producing countries who want the price to be at a certain level, and they want to have certain certain control over export and import and so on, because they want a certain price for their commodities. And then of course the whole idea of whether you're producing for a market or whether you're producing for self-sufficient, so self-consumption. So this whole idea of self-sufficiency versus cash crops, and that balance also has to be maintained, because if you produce only for yourself, then you're not exporting and you will not be able to get any revenue out of that, versus if you produce everything for the outside economy and world market, then there's nothing left for your own people to buy and eat. So largely, the question then remains that how to control this volatility, this variability in food pricing, food availability, food procurement. And that's what the idea of food security is all about, that we need to make sure that this variability is somehow addressed so that food is accessible to everyone, and the policies are designed in a way to address the challenges that we just talked about.